Okay, so you didn't miss much. I just thank David and Arantxa for the invitation. And I just want to say that I'm genuinely happy to finally be able to visit the center here, which I have admired ever since my early student years back in Mexico. And also for the opportunity to get to know some of its wonderful researchers and the current projects that are being tackled in the center. Perhaps the timing of the talk was not ideal. Many people are right now in carnival mood, perhaps rightly so. But I sincerely appreciate that some of you decided to stick around and made it today. So thank you very much for this. So when David invited me to give a talk, I tried to think about which of my ongoing projects could be of maximum interest to the scholars working at the center these days, right? So I seriously consider sharing some of my work on the organism-environment relationship in biology, which has been my main topic of research for some years. But I ended up choosing something related to the scientific study of cognition and its evolution that also has some connections with development and Evo-Devo, a field I know some of you have been engaging with for many years, right? So I must say that cognition is a relatively new domain for me, but I am quite excited to continue working on it in the near future with my dear colleague Matthew Sims, the person who made me start thinking about these issues more seriously in the first place. So what I will present today is work done in collaboration with Matt, who recently started a position at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. If you're not familiar with Matt's work, I'd strongly recommend that you check out what he's been up to in the philosophy of the cognitive sciences and the philosophy of biology, especially his freshly published Cambridge element on slide molds and how they can be used as valuable lenses for approaching various topics in the philosophy of biology, such as niche construction, complex life cycles, biological individuality, cellular memory, and so on. All right, so I'll simply start with the content part of my intervention. In the philosophy of cognitive science and cognitive science more generally, the following fundamental scope question arises. Where does biological cognition begin? By addressing which kinds of organisms exhibit cognition and identifying some shared feature common to such organisms, this question is thought to reveal something important about the nature of cognition. Mainly, there have been two general, yet not exhaustive ways that this scope question has been approached. What we call a definition-first approach and an evolutionary-driven approach. The first approach starts off with the assumption that cognition refers to a process or a bundle of processes and then proceeds in introducing a criterion or set of interrelated criteria that demarcates cognition from other non-cognitive biological processes such as, say, metabolism, physiological regulatory processes, and the like. The demarcation criterion, usually in the form of necessary and sufficient conditions, is then used to adjudicate whether or not some specific kind of organismal behavior is or is not cognitively driven. Such an approach to answering the scope question is usually taken up by philosophers and framed in terms of identifying the so-called mark of the cognitive, or similarly, singling out some necessary feature that satisfy the requirements for minimal cognition. Right? So there have been numerous suggestions as to what such marks are, ranging from having representational states with intentionality to exhibiting sensory-motor coordination or future-oriented intentional dynamics and a large, etc. Right? So picture your favorite mark of the cognitive being listed here on the slide. To date, this manner of addressing the scope question has proven itself to be reminiscent of the many-headed hydra immortalized in Greek myth. Any attempt to answer it once and for all has tended to stubbornly give rise to more questions of similar or some form requiring even more criteria and or more nuancing of all criteria ad infinitum, right? No one is happy. That said, definition-first approaches are useful because they can serve instrumentally as a means to rouse interest in the general notion of cognition or a particular construal of cognition, enlisting more soldiers in the battle to slay the many-headed hydra, right? To finally understand what cognition is or is not. But needless to say, the hydra is still alive and slithering. There is another manner of addressing the scope question. Skewing the search of the mark of the cognitive, it takes an evolutionary-driven approach. Accordingly, a different articulation of the question might be, How far back can we traverse the phylogenetic tree and identify instances of biological processes that are fundamentally analogous to and or in historical continuity with those processes that have been investigated within the domain of traditional cognitive science? Central to this approach is the evolutionary assumption that many of the capacities that are found in phyletically younger taxa, like ourselves, have functional predecessors in older taxa from which they have evolved. Some of these older capacities and their underlying causal mechanisms, the assumption goes, have been evolutionarily conserved due to their contribution to differential survival and reproduction, namely fitness. With this assumption to hand, evolutionary first approaches look to investigate specific instances of putative cognitive capacities in extant organisms that are phylogenetically distant from us. They aim to identify common principles and conserve cognitive mechanisms that are shared between structurally and functionally simpler organisms and those that are more complex according to certain metrics. For example, multicellular organisms with a diversity of cell types and cell functions. In recent years, this approach to investigating cognition has become increasingly more popular and has been marshaled in the research program of Basal Cognition. It should be emphasized that basal cognition is neither a type of cognition, for example, minimal cognition, nor should this specific research program be confused with or overgeneralized with to include any and all research that has been previously investigated the evolution of cognition, say in invertebrates or in other structurally simple neuronal metazoans. But what is basal cognition, right? For the purposes of getting empirical investigation of the ground, basal cognition researchers conceptualize biological cognition as a toolkit of adaptive capacities that have been shaped and maintained by commonplace evolutionary processes, including, of course, Darwinian evolution by natural selection. Formulated so as to be phyletically neutral, the basal toolkit is based upon various capacities that have previously been observed in many organisms, including bacteria, right? So these include, but are not limited to, memory, learning, decision-making, perception, anticipation, balance, and different forms of behavior. Hopefully the slide is not too small, the table in the slide. So in recognizing that each of these capacities have been shaped by natural selection and other evolutionary forces and are thus fundamental biological processes, a particular emphasis is placed on taking an evolutionary perspective on cognition, right? So what in principle some authors contain sets basal cognition apart from a purely conceptual manner of answering the scope question is that its focus on theories that generate, in principle, some testable hypotheses, right? So in this regard, it tries to prioritize experimental results over a priori reasoning about criteria for cognition, evaluating hypotheses based on empirical findings. However, pulling in the opposite direction of a tradition that views cognition as something that is unique to neuronal organisms, the basal cognition program has been met with a fair amount of skepticism both by philosophers and scientists. For example, it is argued that there is no irrefutable evidence that what is being called, say, learning or memory in non-neuronal organisms is remotely similar to what cognitive scientists are interested in when investigating learning and memory, for example, in humans, right? Additionally, philosopher Carrie Figdor, portrayed in the slide, contends that even when scientists are able to employ the same type of mathematical and computational models for capturing the adaptive flexibility of non-neuronal organisms' behaviors, for example, by modeling them as feedback control mechanisms, the phylogenetic and conceptual relationships of these feedbacks the phylogenetic and conceptual relationship of these feedback control behaviors to those of organisms we already accept as cognitive is left out of the models, right? Moreover, the very idea of approaching cognition by way of investigating the behavior and underlying mechanisms in, say, bacteria is seen by some authors as preposterous and harmful to both cognitive science and biology, right? So Matt and I think that this skepticism is healthy for keeping thriving research areas on the check, although it should not be fully restrictive or prohibited, but rather constructive to the science that nevertheless is being carried out. Here, rather than argue directly against why we think blanket skepticism is generally unwarranted, we want to focus on what we see as the main problem with basal cognition research, a problem that we think could become a strong advantage if addressed in the future, right? The problem is that basal cognition has not seriously drawn from established evolutionary fields that have dealt with similar, hard-to-characterize biological processes such as development. Thus, today we would like to draw parallels with how the evolution of development, another loaded concept that refers to a not so easily definable bundle of phenomena, has been approached in the now consolidated, empirically profitable field of evolutionary developmental biology, Evo-Devo. By comparing basal cognition research approach to cognition with Evo-Devo's approach to development, we hope to show that the former can be informed by the latter in ways that improve its standing as a fully evolutionary approach. Part of the rationale for launching this comparison is that development, just as cognition, is one of those umbrella scientific concepts whose unequivocal characterization has proven elusive, and disagreement abounds among scholars, not to mention that no overarching theory of development appears to be in sight. Although the question of establishing a definition-first approach to development seemed to be pressing during the 1950s when embryology transformed into developmental biology, definitional concerns eventually receded into the background as empirical research took off, and a comprehensive conceptualization of development was not seen as a prerequisite for the emergence of Evo-Devo in the 1980s, which was also, we must say, highly contentious among evolutionary biologists in its beginning and well into the early 2000s. Now, another resemblance between development and cognition is that many of the same types of questions we can ask about the evolution of development and developmental repertoires can be, in principle, asked of the evolution of cognition and cognitive capacities. This includes, among others, how many times have they evolved in phylogenetic history? Which cognitive or developmental traits are homologous or homoplastic in which taxa? Could certain cognitive or developmental processes, in particular organisms, be sui generis due to its prior evolutionary history, or are they rather indicative of a larger lineage or clade? And so on and so forth. So through our comparison between how development has been approached from an evolutionary perspective in Evo-Devo, we identify 4 specific parallels with the basal cognition program that bear upon its prospects for becoming a fully evolutionary research field that is able to address the scope problem, or at least that is in good direction to do so. First, both fields try to conduct comparative causal mechanistic investigations to uncover shared developmental or cognitive toolkits and capacities. Second, researchers in each area assume similar stances regarding the phylogenetic scope of development and/or cognition. Third, when investigating developmental and cognitive capacities or traits, sound phylogenetic thinking can aid in distinguishing between homologies and homoplasies, as well as in countenouncing convergence in evolutionary scenarios. Right? I'll explain what this means later. Fourth, by adopting a fully evolutionary perspective, the laws, gain, and uniqueness of traits should be studied in particular lineages. Now, it should be said that these parallels are not categorically equivalent for basal cognition as it is presently practiced, right? So the first 2 are descriptive of current work, while the last 2 have a normative bent regarding the considerations that we think scientists could bear in mind when adopting a bona fide evolutionary perspective, for example, in terms of methodology or inference generation and justification. Importantly, however, is that each parallel signals some promising features of the basal cognition approach. These notwithstanding, each of them also comes with important cautionary notes, attention to which we believe will ultimately improve basal cognition standing as an evolutionary grounded approach to investigating cognition. So let's jump to the first parallel, which is that both basal cognition and Evo-Devo engage in causal mechanistic research and attempt to uncover shared toolkits among distantly related organisms, right? So in particular, some of you know that Evo-Devo has aimed to find common developmental genes across taxa. Today, this is a rather uncontroversial pursuit, right? No one questions its value anymore, its validity, sorry. But when the field was just emerging, a discovery shocked scientists. A group of genes, now called Hox genes, first found in fruit flies, exist in many animal groups. These genes were originally known for causing strange homeotic mutations in Drosophila melanogaster, like an extra pair of wings instead of halteres, or legs growing where antennae should be. Hox genes are transcription factors, later found in other eukaryotic groups as well, which contain an 180 base pair sequence, right? The so-called homeo box that encodes a region called the homeo domain. In a large range of bilateral metazoans, right? Those animals with bilateral symmetry like arthropods and chordates. This region binds to DNA to regulate the expression of downstream genes related to anterior-posterior patterning, right? The surprise of discovering the widespread presence of Hox genes was in large part due to the theoretical expectations from evolutionary biologists at the time. For instance, in a representative statement, the renowned evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr stressed, and I'm going to do an evil voice to quote Mayr because, well, he was kind of an evil character in a sense. Much that has been learned about gene physiology makes it evident that the search for homologous genes is quite futile, except in very close relatives. No more evil voices, don't worry. However, against these conceptual presuppositions, soon other orthologous genes in other developmental processes, for example, in eye or appendage formation, were found across invertebrate and vertebrate species. In the next years, Evo-Devoists uncover a relatively small set of key regulatory genes, for example, transcription factors and components of paracrine signaling pathways related to conserved developmental patterning functions for tissues, organs, and body access that came to be known as the genetic toolkit. Ever since the discovery of Hox genes, Evo-Devo has been in the business of providing causal mechanistic explanations of development and its evolution. Contemporary Evo-Devoists investigate gene regulatory networks, generic mesoscale physical forces and dynamical patterning modules, epigenetic mechanisms, and among many other phenotype-generating causal mechanisms or processes, right? Similar to Evo-Devo, Basal Cognition research seems to be searching for causal mechanistic realizers of the various capacities comprising the so-called basal cognitive toolkit. Right? Scientists are investigating intracellular and intercellular mechanisms such as signal transduction, oscillations, cell networks, bioelectricity, cell-cell adhesion, and local, regional, and systemic regulatory responses. As a reminder of something I said at the beginning, the basal toolkit comprises various purported cognitive capacities such as balance, anticipation, orienting responses, and memory that are presumed to be common across different taxa, neuronal and non-neuronal alike, right? So the investigation of these capacities is achieved by searching for shared mechanisms that underpin them, or at least this is the hope for basal cognition researchers. Now, at this point, we must stress an important cautionary note that emerges from this parallel. The search for developmental toolkits through causal mechanistic research did not lead to the revolutionary transformation of evolutionary biology that Evo-Devoists were forecasting at the discipline's onset, right? Instead, it only became part of standard scientific inquiries, now well entrenched in the horizon of what counts as respectable evolutionary investigations. We anticipate that basal cognition research may follow a similar trajectory. After an initial period of strong skepticism regarding the fruitfulness of searching for putative cognitive capacities and underlying cognitive mechanisms across neuronal and non-neuronal species due to theoretical preconceptions, we forecast that this type of research will become a standard procedure in comparative studies of cognition. And in this sense, contrary to the pronouncements of some basal cognition proponents like Pamela Lyon and colleagues, comparative mechanistic research alone is unlikely to bring a paradigm shift for cognitive science. One important reason for thinking along these lines is that finding causal mechanistic commonalities in different organisms is only the first step towards asking interesting and nuanced evolutionary questions. In Evo-Devo, the unearthing of Hox genes, branded by some scholars as a period of Hoxmania, soon led to the Hox paradox, or the question of how to explain the incredible phenotypic diversity of animals if they all share the same set of developmental genes. Why does a coconut crab look so different than a star-nosed mole or a gossamer worm if they share the same basic genetic developmental toolkit? Renewed explanations of phenotypic diversity thus became a pressing need in the explanatory agenda of Evo-Devo. Analogously, in basal cognition research, finding common capacities and their underlying mechanisms in different organisms is only the first step towards asking interesting and nuanced questions about the evolution of such capacities and mechanisms. Consider a quick example. Communication via potassium ion channel gating in both bacterial biofilms and neuronal networks both involve imputative memory processes, right? So despite these shared mechanisms, there's significant functional variation in memory between the systems. This raises a crucial evolutionary question. Why and how did such variation in purported cognitive capacities arise even when underlying mechanisms are conserved? We think that finding common cognitive mechanisms is a promising first step, but understanding functional variation in different response profile for the same process in different taxa should not be disregarded. Actually, this is fundamental if you want to do good evolutionary research. Oscillating between investigating commonalities and differences is a core aspect of becoming a fully evolutionary research field and allows for avoiding unhelpful polemics and biases, right? It avoids, first of all, glossing over the kinds of variation that developmental and cognitive phylogeny are dependent upon. And in connection to this point, we arrived at the next parallel. When considering the phylogenetic scope of development, one could also adopt a priori definition-first stances regarding its distribution in the tree of life, right? Similar to the prevailing approach for examining cognition. Scholars that choose this path usually assume that both development or cognition are either highly restrictive in the reach or that they are ubiquitous, right? That is present in all living forms. We call these oligoextensionalist and pan-extensionalist positions, respectively. Oligoextensionalist views should be familiar to all of us, right? Namely, cognition exists only in metazoans with proper neural systems, while true development is limited to 5 multicellular clades and only to those clades, right? Animals, plants, red algae, brown algae, and fungi. In contrast, pan-extensionalist views for either cognition or development are less widespread, but still they can be found in both scientific and philosophical scholarship, right? Under these lights, all living systems are deemed veritably cognitive, and with respect to development, all living systems are taken to exhibit and embody this process in their life histories, right? From extremophile bacteria to blue whales and what have you. For oligoextensionalists, development covers the growth, differentiation, pattern formation, and remodeling that gives rise to typical adult forms of clonal multicellular organisms. So in this sense, development can be investigated as a sort of canonical set of events surrounding the changing structures of an organism en route towards adulthood, right? For animals, these events ordinarily comprise fertilization, cleavage, gastrulation, organogenesis, including, of course, neurulation, and for some groups, metamorphosis, right? Contrary to this approach, some Evo-Devoists have called for shedding our preconceptions of what development is supposed to refer, right? Taking animals as a paradigmatic case, and being attentive to the kind of changes and trajectories that organisms from different phylogenetic groups undergo throughout their life's histories, right? So with this evolutionary diverse window frame, development could hardly be seen as the path from unicellularity to multicellularity, or something that ceases upon the attainment of an adult typical form, right? Indeed, if we look at the diversity of extant organisms in their life cycle, if we really take biodiversity seriously, few follow the order transformation that turns an egg first into an embryo, then into a juvenile, and finally into an adult. For pan-extensionalists about development, then, development refers to the structure sequence of changes any organism experiences throughout its lifespan, which alter its morphology, physiology, and behavior. For the domain of cognition, being a pan-extensionalist is one way of subscribing a strong life-mind continuity thesis, right? The idea that mind is, and always has been, prefigured and indissociable from all forms of life. In this sense, some defenders of disparate frameworks, such as enactivism, the free energy principle, among many others, can be counted as pan-extensionalists in this very abstract meta-theoretical sense, right? Importantly, being a pan-extensionalist about cognition is not the same, of course, as endorsing biopsychism, right? The position that all life is not only cognitive, but also sentient, right? And pan-extensionalism is not, again, panpsychism, which extend mindedness to all kinds of matter, living and non-living alike, right? Pan-extensionalism about cognition is only the claim that posits that all forms of life engage in one form or another in cognitive processes, right? Without these implying sentience or things like autonoetic consciousness. Now, in contrast, oligoextensionalists about cognition differ in which animals, besides vertebrate, like mammals and birds, they consider to exhibit cognition, right? Some people dispute the existence of cognition in insects, others accept it. And they can be quite pluralistic regarding how to construe and assess it. Nonetheless, they are still to be classified as oligoextensionalists because across the vast span of evolved lineages constituting the tree of life, they restrict cognition to few clades within the, comparatively speaking, diminutive clade of metazoa, right? Animals. Basal Cognition is a research program that pushes against oligoextensionalism of cognition, and some of its proponents have endorsed pan-extensionalism as an antidote to its biases, right? For example, here, Pamela Lyon and Cheng, in a recent introduction to a special issue, say, life depends on processing information. Cognition is part and parcel of life. And I could use many other quotes, right, to show that at least Pamela Lyon and some of her close colleagues are pan-extensionalists about cognition. Now, in contemporary Evo-Devo, both oligoextensionalism and pan-extensionalism about development seem to coexist, but they guide different kinds of empirical investigations, right? And this is what will help us to bring into focus the upshots and limitations of the second parallel we want to foreground. Consider for a moment what pan-extensionalists about development and cognition are actually fighting against, which is something particular. Pan-extensionalist about development has challenged a specific a priori oligoextensionalist tenet, namely that development is something that only happens to clonal multicellular organisms, ruling out cases of aggregative multicellularity and the changes that single-celled organisms undergo throughout the life cycles. Likewise, basal cognition researchers impunge a particular tenet of oligoextensionalist framings, namely that cognitive capacities can be exclusively instantiated by neuronal animals. For convenience, let's refer to the former tenet as strict multicellularism and to the latter as strict neuronalism, right? So destabilizing these tenets brings some promising investigative avenues. For instance, destabilizing strict multicellularism has generated very interesting lines of research within Evo-Devo. The idea of development in unicellular eukaryotes may have been completely dismissed some years ago, but today there is ample evidence of developmental processes in unicellular protists, right? Likewise, disavowing strict multicellularism has allowed scientists to investigate bacterial morphogenesis. For example, the mechanisms through which sphere, rod, or spiral shapes are secured, or apply the notion of developmental trajectories to the formation of biofilms. Also, for basal cognition advocates, destabilizing and resisting strict neuronalism opens new research avenues, right? For instance, recent biological research focused on the behaviors of various unicellular organisms such as the ciliate Stenton ceruleus and the acellular slime mold Physarum polycephalum, shout out to Matt, have provided evidence that habituation, a simple form of learning, does not require neuronal processing. Habituation is characterized by a progressive decrease in behavioral response to a stimulus as a result of repeated encounter with the same stimulus. Moreover, understanding the evolutionary origins of neurons and nervous systems, right, early nerve nets, requires investigating non-neuronal organisms within and outside the animal kingdom. Now, these investigative openings notwithstanding, we argue that taking a fully evolutionary driven approach means that one cannot subscribe oligoextensionalism nor pan-extensionalism from the get-go, either for development or for cognition. Truly thinking in evolutionary terms makes us reckon with the fact that we need to situate the evolutionary processes and patterns on the study in phylogenetic context, and only through that we can attack the scope question. For this, the scope of cognition in a fully evolutionary view should be seen as an open question, revisable under the influx of empirical evidence and not something decided conceptually and theoretically from the beginning. In general, evolutionary-driven approaches are promising for transcending biases and steering clear of reifying extreme positions. So uncritically subscribing to pan-extensionalism could impede scientific hypothesis construction and testing, and more generally, could obscure the intricate relationships between the processes and capacities subsumed under these broad umbrella terms, right? Development, cognition. In particular, if cognition is stipulated as a feature of all organisms, stipulated, past and present, the largest evolutionary puzzle then resides where, of course, in the origin of life itself, which would be also identical to the root of cognition, rendering subsequent inquiries on the evolution of cognition as mere complexifying elaboration on a common theme, right? But philosophical adherence to a priori fixed conceptions of cognition in both oligo-extensionalists and pan-extensionalist camps can hinder the formulation of hypotheses that diverge from these conceptions or obscure evidence that contradicts them. We would like to argue that deciding between oligo-extensionalism and pan-extensionalism is a matter of first carrying out observations, performing experiments, do good phylogenetic screenings of organisms, and letting the results of such experiments help theory construction and help scientists determine which organisms engage in which forms of cognitively driven behavior, if at all, and how those specific forms might share some commonalities or differ from those exhibited by other taxa. Now, moving forward, let's see what are the promising avenues, and Cautionary notes that sound evolutionary comparative phylogenetic thinking, another stepping stone en route to becoming a fully evolutionary approach, could bring to research on basal cognition. Evo-Devo, as an established evolutionary field, employs multiple styles of thinking to study evolution, right? So these include causal mechanistic pursuits, as we saw before, but also things like population thinking, focusing on evolutionary forces driving trait frequency changes, or tree thinking for cross-species comparison and mapping evolutionary relations, and homology thinking for understanding trait individuation during development and their quasi-independent evolutionary trajectories. Explaining the diversity of characters across the tree of life, including cognitive characters, requires understanding various diversification processes and their phylogenetic context. And distinguishing between homologies and homoplasies is crucial in this task. By comparing lineages and organisms from different species, evolutionary biologists bring together tree thinking and homology thinking and aim to uncover ancestral relationships that underlie the shared identity of certain characters, namely homologies. For example, different variations of the tetrapod limb, right? A character that is presumed to be historically continuous. But finding similar characteristics in different organisms may be explained by retention from common ancestry, homology, but a careful phylogenetic appraisal may instead reveal that they are homoplasies, that is, independently derived traits due to things like convergent evolution, when you have common selective pressures, right, like the wings of bats, birds, and bees, or through parallel evolution, when similar developmental mechanisms independently produce comparable traits in different taxa, or even that they experience reversal to a plesiomorphic state, right? Now, drawing inspiration from Evo-Devo, basal cognition research could benefit from adopting tree thinking and homology thinking. These approaches would help differentiate between homologies and homoplasies in cognitive traits and capacities. Distinguishing independent evolution from genuine homologous continuities is essential for avoiding misguided inferences and unwarranted extrapolations. This approach requires proper phylogenetic evidence, right? We need phylogenetic evidence to decide these kind of things. The pan-extensionalist position in basal cognition research assumes that similarities in cognitive toolkits across different life forms are indicative of homology. However, mere similarity is insufficient to infer homology, since both homology and homoplasy involve similarities in traits, right? That's the whole point. Proper phylogenetic contextualization is needed for adjudicate if something is a homology or a homoplasy, right? The fact that it's similar does not tell us anything by its own. Basal cognition research must explicitly assess this rather than making assumptions based on similar behaviors or mechanisms in organisms with unclear evolutionary relationships. While not ruling out homology in traits related to basal cognitive capacities, we emphasize the need for stronger evidence to support such broad claims. Perhaps it's true that all of these similarities are homologous in nature, but we need phylogenetic evidence for asserting that instead of simply assuming it from the get-go. In extant organisms, we could witness similar cognitive capacities like memory, decision-making, and anticipation, but it is entirely possible that some of these could be the product of common ancestry, while others could have independently evolved in different branches or lineages giving rise to them. Right? Why? Because convergent evolution is widespread, and we tend to underestimate it. For instance, Evo-Devoists have assumed evidence for the hypothesis that bilaterian central nervous systems evolve independently in chordates and protostomes. Right? This has an impact, for example, on the comparative judgments we make between the nervous systems of, say, vertebrates and insects. Correspondingly, convergent evolution cannot be ruled out for putative cognitive traits and even larger cognitive capacities in organisms from disparate lineages. If cognition, as characterized in basal cognition research, involves mechanisms for processing information to interact with the environment and meet existential needs, why couldn't these processes have evolved multiple times throughout life's history? Importantly, convergently evolved traits have no lesser standing. For instance, there's a lot of fossil and molecular evidence suggesting that leaves are convergent traits, right? So megaphilous leaves in phyllophytes, right? Gymnosperms, ferns, and angiosperms, and also microphilous leaves in lycophytes, cloth mosses, spike mosses, and killworts may be homoplastic, having independently emerged countless times in plant evolution. Leaves, countless times. But this does not mean that these remarkable structures linked to photosynthesis and transpiration found across plants are not leaves, or that we should not call them leaves because they not derive from one and singular lineage. Likewise, we don't assert that plant development is not development because it is a product of independent evolution from animal development. And some authors argue that it is precisely because animal and plant development are convergent that we can gain insights into what is truly general about development by comparing them. And at the same time, these comparisons accentuate the fact that certain processes are genuinely unique in both groups and cannot be generalized. So why cognition could only be called cognition if it is tied to the lineages traditionally studied by cognitive scientists, as oligoextensionalists would have it, or as pan-extensionalists presume, if it is a batch of capacities that all and every single organism instantiates? What are the arguments and the evidential basis to not even entertain the possibility of independent evolution of cognitive traits and capacities throughout the tree of life? Why? If we adopt an evolutionary approach, this should be expected and should not strike us as, anathema. There is thus a third cautionary note, we think, that basal cognition researchers should bear in mind regarding possible convergent cognitive capacities. Our suggestion for basal cognition research is that it should not simply be aware of homoplasies when countering strict neuronalism, but rather that it should countenance the importance of the evolutionary route and the frequency with which it happens, right? Convergent evolution, independent evolution, complement a more linear view of cognitive evolution with scenarios of parallel and convergent evolution of cognitive traits and capacities. This is much more closer to how evolutionary research is done and uncovered for other types of traits. With this in mind, we think that the evolution of cognitive traits and capacities, if treated with suitable phylogenetic tools and contexts, cannot be construed as a linear march of progress, of complexification, right? A set of milestones that certain lineages have, but not others, reaching to the human as the pinnacle of progress, cognitive progress. And we will showcase why this is problematic in the final parallel, right? So by embracing phylogenetically oriented thinking, the research undertaking under the basal cognition umbrella could profit from investigating phyletic evolution more closely. That is, evolution within particular lineages, right? So in this sense, it is important to stress that losses and gains of traits can come about. And the evolution of cognition should not be an exception on this regard if we assume that cognitive traits are biological traits. As a general remark, over the course of phyletic evolution, one could attest relatively complexification or simplification under the clades under study. Right? Evo-Devo asks, for example, if there is coevolution between certain organelles, for example, the Warrening bodies of the Ascomycota phyla, and multicellular complexity. But in contrast, evolutionary biologists also ponder on the causal factors that explain why, for example, aggregative multicellular organisms have stayed simple. Although organismal complexification is one way in which evolution proceeds to produce variation in particular lineages, it is not the only way by any means. The role of simplification is becoming increasingly recognized as a major driver of trait diversity within Evo-Devo and evolutionary biology more generally. Secondary simplification, as the term suggests, refers to the idea that the evolution of traits as observed in some extant species may have involved a trajectory from complex to simple or from more complex to less complex traits. Such simplifications, for example, could involve genetic streamlining when there is deletion of genes or gene complexes and/or the gradual loss of anatomical structure or even behavioral phenotypes. Many examples of Evo-Devo research and discussions on secondary simplification could be cited, including cases to floral evolution, segment evolution, and even nervous system evolution in metazoans. The implications of secondary simplifications are an underexplored topic in Basal Cognition research, a program which we think has been grounded on an assumption of complexification over evolutionary timescales. And there is a tendency to think in linear terms, right, instead of branching and accepting the multiplicity of lineages through a bona fide evolutionary perspective. Now, one additional moral of the story, to paraphrase Clark, is that simple does not always mean evolutionary primitive. In fact, as some Evo-Devoists have argued, basal taxa are not necessarily the best available stand-ins for ancestors. And these, due to being adjacent to the root or in proximity to it in a phylogenetic tree, are often incorrectly interpreted as having undergone less change or thought to be more primitive or ancestral than subsequently branching lineages. It might be beneficial for basal cognition researchers to ponder this when selecting the organisms they will study, right? Proper phylogenetic contextualization for choosing your model organism should be the minimum baseline for a proper evolutionary research. Now, complexification and simplification are just two evolutionary scenarios that involve gains and losses of traits in evolutionary history. However, the parallel that we are delineating for basal cognition research goes beyond these scenarios. We want to underscore the overall importance of gains and losses of traits in evolutionary investigation, something that deeply affects the types of inferences and explanations that should or shouldn't be drawn from species chosen for scientific study, right? In this domain, Evo-Devo has many lessons to bestow to basal cognition research, right? For one, Evo-Devoists argue that both losses and gains are both explanatorily important, like in the case of offering an account of the major transitions in land-plant evolution, right? So evolution is sometimes described from a phylogenetic perspective as a never-ending cycle of gains and losses, right? So why couldn't this be the case also for cognitive evolution? In this tenor, and building from the corpus of knowledge on the evolution of other biological features, we anticipate that both gains and losses will prove to be salient when addressing the evolution of certain cognitive traits present in extant organisms, and perhaps for the evolution of some of the cognitive capacities in the more encompassing basal toolkit. Finally, there are a few extra things to bear in mind. So Evo-Devoists like George and Nextabur have argued that we should fight our unintentional bias toward interpretations that favor trait gains over losses, right? This bias needs to be fought against in basal cognition research as well. Moreover, Sadier and colleagues have shown that the loss of traits is not an all or nothing phenomena, but rather that traits are lost to varying degrees along a so-called trait loss continuum. The loss and gains of cognitive characters could also be subject to evolvable potentials and that are not always expressed, but that could easily tilt in one or the other direction in particular lineages or taxa. Now, in the loss and gains of traits, including complexifications and simplifications, are intricate explananda for evolutionary research, but they are also powerful explanantia in fully evolutionary fields, right? Recognizing their significance and giving them adequate treatment would help ensure that basal cognition research develops in a manner that is consistent with being a fully evolutionary approach. The final remark that Matt and I would like to advance on this theme is that countenancing losses and gains in cognitive evolution forces us to reckon with the fact that in some lineages, and only in some lineages, there might be cases of unique traits. In this sense, a fully evolutionary research program should not avoid questions about cognitive uniqueness. For instance, let's say in Homo sapiens, but also in non-human organisms, including non-neuronal ones, right? As an illustration, if enough evolutionary evidence allows us to call certain fungi species cognitive, they might be unique in different ways that, for instance, birds or humans might fail to be completely. Now, let me now wrap up, right? At the beginning of this talk, we distinguished two distinct manners of investigating the phylogenetic scope of biological cognition. The first of which, the definition-first approach, engages in the philosophical practice of constructing and amending characterizations of cognition and is primarily guided by intuitions of what cognition is and where it is to be found in the biological world. Using an evolutionary-driven approach represents a second manner of trying to investigate cognitive scope. While working definitions are a starting point, this kind of approach leads with what empirical investigations and phylogenetic contextualization reveal about the presence or absence or various cognitive capacities in the organisms investigated. Here, the question of cognitive scope is not a question that reduces to one of strictly characterizing and meeting a definitive mark of the cognitive, but is rather grounded in a question about how certain cognitive capacities that we recognize as such might have evolved. The program of basal cognition embodies this latter kind of approach and has the potential to avoid some of the stalemates and unending semantic battles, right, or familiar many-headed hydra that have plagued definition-first approaches. But to help showing how evolutionary-driven approaches can be strengthened further, we have tried to uncover 4 parallels between the fields of Evo-Devo and basal cognition research. 1, the search for shared conserved toolkits and the importance of comparative causal mechanistic research. 2, similar stances about the scope of development and cognition, right? We see both oligoextensionalism and panextensionalism happening both in Evo-Devo and in cognitive science and basal cognition research. 3, the implementation of phylogenetic thinking to uncover homologies and homoplasies, especially possible convergent routes of evolution. And 4, the possibility to study losses, gains, and uniqueness of traits, including complexification and simplification in particular lineages, right? So for each of the parallels identified, related cautionary notes for basal cognition have been drawn out, right? For example, the need to complement investigation on evolutionary conservation with research on evolutionary divergence and differences. The pitfalls of trying to adjudicate between the antipodes of panextensionalism and oligoextensionalism about cognition in a purely or fully empirically detached manner, and the lack of attention paid to convergent evolution and the loss and gains of traits, notably secondary simplification, and sometimes assuming that basal means primitive, right? So these are all cautionary notes that we hope will provide some guidance for this new research program on its way of becoming a fully evolutionary field. So let me just say that if you are interested in this type of discussions, of course, there is a better articulation of the arguments in the paper version. So I recommend you to check it out. And also, I'm going to end on a shameful note because, well, this is what happens. My other research line, which is on the organism-environment relationship, in biology is, fully captured or will crystallize in a forthcoming book that will probably appear in the fall. So if you're interested about how scientists have thought about organism-environment interactions, how to separate them, what's the nature of the reciprocity between these bonds, or issues about organismal agency, then perhaps this could be of interest to you. Now, end shameful note. And then again, I would like to thank you all for listening to this talk. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I hope it was provocative enough so that we can have an interesting discussion. And I would like to thank Carrie Figdorf, Fred Keisler, and the members of the Ramsey Lab for feedback on works on this topic. So thank you very much.